Mr. Angel, we good? Okay. All right. Commissioner, I think we're set.
Are the mics on?
Nope.
They're not.
Hello? No? Hello, hello?
They're not on.
Hello? Can you hear me now? Hello? How are we doing there, Angel? Got one of those nights? One of those days.
We're rolled out.
I know it.
That's true.
Well, I know.
Yeah.
Press the right button that time.
Can we stand to salute the flag?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I would like to advise those present that the notice of this special meeting of the Housing Authority of the City of Hoboken has been provided to the public in accordance with provisions of the Open Public Meetings Act. Notice of this special August board meeting has been scheduled for Monday, August 1st, 2022, was given by publication of the special meeting notice of the authority with amendments as necessary, and was sent to the Jersey Journal and Star Ledger as a public notice on Friday, June 10th, 2022, as notification to the general public of the meeting. Sent to the City Clerk of Hoboken on Monday, July 25th, 2022, with a copy of the agenda to be posted on the bulletin board in City Hall, Hoboken Library, and Hoboken Police Department, and posted on the Authority website on Monday, July 25th, 2022. I direct the minutes of this meeting to state that I have announced that the adequate notice of this meeting has been given as required by the Open Public Meetings Act.
Thank you so much. Ready for the roll?
Yeah, roll call, Director.
Anthony Forbes. Andrew Impastato.
Present.
Aaron Lewitt. Here. Barbara Reyes.
Here.
Michael Russo.
Present.
James Sanford.
See him online.
I think you're muted, James.
Present.
Erica Seitzman.
Here.
Madam Chair, you want me to introduce?
Sure, absolutely.
And just for the members of the public, as well as the members of the Board of Commissioners, the reason we're here tonight is to hold a public hearing regarding proposed changes to the Housing Authority's annual plan, and those changes are the proposed revisions to the admissions and continued occupancy policy with respect to preferences, eligibility for preferences and placement on the public housing waiting list, and the adoption or the potential adoption of a new criminal activity policy for the authority, which is intended to replace what is commonly known as the one-strike policy, the existing one-strike policy. And each of these were introduced by the Housing Authority Board at prior meetings a few months ago, have been available on the Housing Authority's website, and the Housing Authority will accept comment tonight from members of the public. We'll also accept written comments for the next few days, and that's on the Authority website as well. And the idea here is that any comments given will be considered in the creation of a final version, which will come before the Housing Authority Board at its regular meeting on August 11th for potential adoption. And the last step is, if it is any changes that are adopted at that meeting, will be sent to HUD for HUD approval. And occasionally HUD has some comments and some things that they ask for minor revisions that happened with the adoption of the full admissions and continued occupancy policy. There were a few changes made, and then HUD approved that and it was enacted. So the hope here is that the Housing Authority Board will consider it at the August 11th meeting. It'll go to HUD. Hopefully HUD will have a relatively quick turnaround for us, and then these can be implemented right away after that.
Counselor, if HUD has any minor changes, does that come back to the board in September?
It does not necessarily require it. It can certainly if you'd like to. If it's minor editorial changes, I don't see that it would need to. The way that any resolution that will come before the board on the 11th will be written It will essentially say that if there are non-substantive changes, it can be enacted right away. If there's something of substance, yes, it would be appropriate for it to come back before the board so the board can consider the substance of whatever that change is.
Okay, you understood? Good, very good.
Do you have anybody who decided to
Yeah, so I would think that we probably ought to do a review first of where we are, since this is a different format than our regular board meeting, and we didn't have a sign-ins because we're going to welcome anyone to come up and speak. And once we review it, once we make our comments, we'll invite the public to have any comments that they have that we might want to consider. Slight difference from our regular meetings.
And if I may, Mr. Director, I can explain this more fully when we get there, but just so anybody sitting in the public knows, any comment at this meeting will be limited to the items on the agenda. The proposed criminal activity policy, the proposed changes to the admissions and continued occupancy policy with respect to preferences.
That goes for all of us. Okay, thank you, Counselor. So we really have two things to consider tonight. One is the revision to the admission and continued occupancy policy, and the other is the drug abuse and criminal activity policy. So let's start with the admission and continued occupancy policy change, which the board did a very tentative approval of back in June, and we worked hard on this, and essentially, I'll just say this as an introduction, essentially what this change is to our admission policy is a change that gives a preference to Hoboken residents. That's the essence of this. I'll let the counselor get into some of the weeds here and why we had to go back and change some other paragraphs, because it's all interlinked, but that's the essential change here. So, Counselor?
Thank you, Director. So there were, with the admissions and continued occupancy policy that was adopted last summer of 2021, and has now been in place after HUD comment for about a year. We did open the waiting list and conduct a lottery under that version of the policy. And there were some comments from members of the public, from members of the board, that they would like to see some tweaks, essentially, to how that system worked the first time. That there was a way that we could tighten things up a little bit to better accommodate Hoboken residents, and not significant changes, but minor changes to better accommodate Hoboken residents, but still make it fair to every potential applicant. So any change that would result from this process, just so anyone knows, would be implemented going forward. The lottery that was held under the version that I'm referring to, those results will stay. Anyone who has been placed on a waiting list as a result of that lottery will stay on the waiting list where they are now. Any changes that are made as a result of what we're talking about here today will be prospective, meaning that it will affect what happens going forward. And even though there is, I think it was 150 pages, Commissioner Lewitt, something like that, of the ACOP, we're really talking about potential changes to 4 pages. Commissioner Score here in person, you can see them outlined in red, but I'll go through them quickly. That way, if anybody has any questions, we don't necessarily have to do the same thing with the criminal activity policy, go through it word for word, but where we're making changes, I'll point out exactly what the proposed changes are, and if anyone has any comment here, certainly feel free to chime in, and then it will be open to any members of the public. So the first proposed change is that previously the lottery was conducted prior to placement using preferences. So the proposed change here, the first proposed change in essence is that under this proposed version, preferences would be applied first, and families would be placed on the waiting list in accordance with those preferences. And we can get into what preferences are in a minute, the specific preferences that will apply. But families will be placed according to those preferences first, and then a lottery will be held, so that we give a little bit more of a leg up to the individuals who qualify for a preference. That was one of the changes that I know some members of the public and some members of the board wanted to see implemented. And It also clarifies a little bit that applications will be placed up to a limit established in any lottery rules, which is really just a slight clarification. I would argue it's not even substantive because it just makes clear what was intended in the previous version of the ACOP. And then I added some language at the bottom of the first page you have before you, which makes clear that if it's determined down the road that a family did not qualify for a particular preference, they won't stay on the wait list essentially as a result of confusion or however else they ended up on there. They would go back into the group of applicants who were in the lottery. So then they essentially will go first, but then they'll be part of the lottery in case we ever need to put them back into the pool of applicants who were part of the lottery, if that makes any sense. I don't know if anybody has any questions about that part. Okay, and then here it just goes through the preferences. This is the existing language. There are actually no changes, but just to make clear, the currently existing preferences are the first preference is given to veterans and surviving spouses, and there is language, very specific language in the state regulations explaining what that means and who qualifies for that. That is actually a state requirement. Veterans and surviving spouses have to be the first preference. It has to exist and it has to be first, and there is certain language within it that explains how you rank people qualifying for different status within that preference. But again, we're not proposing that any of that be changed. That is in our existing ACOP. It's been in there for a year. And then preference number 2 and preference number 3. 2 is involuntarily displaced persons, and that is families residing within the city of Hoboken who have been involuntarily displaced by government action or whose dwelling has been extensively damaged or destroyed and is uninhabitable as a result of fire, flood, or natural disaster. And essentially that is anyone who has had some sort of sudden incident and needs housing right away. So they also, families qualifying there also get a preference. Preference number 3 is displaced persons who are victims of domestic violence. And this is anyone who cannot remain in their existing residence situation because of domestic violence issues, and the Housing Authority has determined that they deserve to essentially be put in line before everybody else. And I mean, frankly, that's good policy and totally reasonable. So again, those 2 preferences already exist, numbers 2 and 3. There is no intention here to change any of that. So that brings us now to preference number 4, which does not exist at the moment. And a little bit of background, if we go back to not the version that it's been in place for a year, but the version of the ACOP that was in place for quite some time before that and was changed several times over the years, there were a number of different preferences. And I think we got to something like 11 or 12 preferences. And it got to be somewhat unwieldy for the Housing Authority. It got to be too much to determine who qualified for which preference and how to prioritize which preference. So the decision was made to limit the preferences only to those applicants who had the most pressing needs. And the Housing Authority Board has asked that that now include preference number 4, which is to be given to residents of the city of Hoboken. And just for those on Zoom, just in case, the language, substantive language is, preference shall be given to individuals or families residing within the jurisdiction of the authority, which is the city of Hoboken, and that is defined elsewhere in the ACOP. Proof of residency requirements shall be determined in the sole discretion of the authority. Requirements may include, but not be limited to, a deed or signed residential lease agreement. What that essentially says is the Housing Authority has latitude to figure out what to require that someone actually is a resident of Hoboken. For example, if someone is living in a Housing Authority building without being on a lease, without having gone through the application process, screening process, eligibility process, just because they are living in one of the housing authority buildings without our permission does not mean that they're entitled to a preference. There will have to be some level of proof in terms of, okay, you say you live in Hoboken, you deserve a preference. Let us see a lease or whatever. Or let us see a letter from a landlord saying you're a month-to-month tenant, or something essentially, or from your friend saying he's been living here for 5 years, he pays half of the utilities, whatever. And the housing authority will have latitude to determine what that is and what to accept. So then, after that, we get into language that shows how different preferences will be ranked. And as previously, preference number 1 has to go first by state regulation, so preference number 1 goes first. And then the housing authority has decided, or is proposing, to group preferences number 2 and 3 into one pool, and anybody who qualifies for either of them will be placed consistent with the method stating in the notice announcing the opening of the waiting list. So if we take applications by date and time, which is a possibility, they would be placed together by date and time. If the housing authority took applications by way of a lottery, they would be placed by way of a lottery, but they would still be placed before anyone else who's not preference 1 or 2 or 3. Then after preferences 1, 2, and 3, we would get to preference 4, which is the proposed new preference, residents of the city of Hoboken. And again, they would be placed in a sequence consistent with the method stated in the notice announcing the opening of the waiting list. So however it was done, whether it was done by lottery or by date and time, preference 4 would be placed after everyone in preference 1 and everyone in preference 2 or 3. So there would still be some advantage given to residents of Hoboken, but to be clear, they would still be after 1, 2, and 3. And I will point out, it's a little getting into the weeds, but preference 1 is open to any veteran or surviving spouse. It is not residents of the city of Hoboken. The state requirement is that it has to be open to any veteran or surviving spouse. Preference 2 and 3, by their definition, are limited to residents of the city of Hoboken to begin with, because it says residing within the jurisdiction. So essentially, everybody after veterans or surviving spouses, if you have a preference, you're a resident of the city of Hoboken. Or if you're a resident of the city of Hoboken, you have a preference. Before we get into anybody who is not a resident at this point. So that is the gist of it. I mean, I don't know if you want to get into specific questions you have on some of the language, but that really is what we're striving for here. And I don't know if anybody has any suggestions on other things they want to see in this specific section.
Nope. Madam Chair, if I might, I think it's perfect the way it is. The only thing I would say is persons who residents of the city of Hoboken is what you have written there. I don't know if that's a typo.
Where are we? Sorry.
If you're looking at preference number 4, it says persons who residents of the city of Hoboken.
Thank you. I will fix that. Non-substantive change. Thank you.
You got to break your chops a little bit.
Fair enough.
That's just the letter R, right? I did, in talking to residents about this change, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. And going over it with folks, they're like, yes, absolutely, we're highly in favor of this. Let's do the next round with a preference for Hoboken residents. So happy to make this happen.
Great.
Madam Chair? Yes. So do we know why in the past we didn't have this? Is that because has it changed?
It changed.
Yeah. Yeah, when we wrote the last ACOP 2 years ago, wrote it, passed it through, we just never included a preference for Hoboken residents.
I remember that. But so it was never a preference?
No, it was.
It was a preference way back when we had like 11, 12 preferences. It was included in there. Then we went with the simplified version of our preferences, which was just the veterans, displaced,
That I remember.
and domestic violence. To try to simplify that, we did not include a preference for Hoboken residents. And once we implemented that, we got the feedback and said, they're right, let's move it and let's change it.
Perfect, thank you.
Anyone else have any questions? answer some questions on these ones?
Do you want to do public comment altogether, or you want to have?
I would ask if anyone has any other comments on this one, I think. I don't want to speak for you.
Well, Mr. Greco, we did say that at our tenant association meeting about that, and we approved it, well, I approved, a few of us approved it. And it's good. About the veterans, about Hoboken residents, yes,
Thank you, Sandra.
yes.
Thank you. So from here, then, we're going to be bringing this to the meeting next week, or August 11th, week after next, and for a final approval, then it gets sent to HUD if they've got any comments. If not, we'll move toward implementing this as our policy.
Awesome.
So if that works, then we'll move on to the drug abuse and criminal activity policy. I believe we passed this through the board as a draft back in March. And so we're bringing it for the hearing today, and it would follow a similar procedure.
And just to give you an introduction on this one, I don't know that it would be as helpful to go through word for word, because this is essentially an entirely new criminal activity policy intended to replace our existing one-strike policy, which, just a little bit of background, the one-strike policies go back to, and I apologize that I don't have the exact date in my head, but it's the late 80s, early 90s. I think it was actually beginning of the Clinton administration, so probably 3-ish, where HUD said you got to have a one-strike policy. And HUD was fairly strict on what needed to be in that one-strike policy. And since then, HUD has gone kind of back in the other direction and has said to housing authorities, actually a one-strike policy is optional. HUD has said these are some of the things we'd like to see, but it's entirely up to you, housing authorities. So what the housing authority has done here is try to make policy that is frankly much clearer than the one we have in place now, much more comprehensive, both in terms of having teeth for the housing authority, being able to enforce the lease with respect to criminal activity, potentially pursue evictions, but it also gives the residents more recourse in terms of how the housing authority handles cases. It's much clearer now, or the proposed version is much clearer in terms of how the housing authority will consider incidents and the factors that the housing authority can consider, including rehabilitation or the removal of the offending resident and allowing the rest of the residents to stay, things like that. It is significantly clearer from a legal standpoint. It will be significantly easier, as far as I'm concerned, to try and handle these cases if they proceed to the court level, because judges want to know, how did you get here, what was your thinking, and can you lay it out clearly? And this policy, as far as I'm concerned, lays out very clearly the steps the housing authority should take. So as long as the housing authority is abiding by this proposed policy, if it's enacted, it will be much easier to stand in front of a judge and justify the actions. And with all that said, obviously the housing authority wants to give residents a fair shot, but at the same time, I know there are many, many residents clamoring for the housing authority to be able to pursue some of these cases. And I don't know, without getting into too much, I don't know if one of you wants to mention it or if you want me to. Without getting into a lot of specific details, there is one case that I know a lot of residents were clamoring for the housing authority to do something, anything about, and the housing authority yesterday, found out that thankfully the action was taken, and because of the case presented, the resident voluntarily moved out without even having to proceed to a trial, which we were prepared to do, but would have taken quite some time. So the fact that the case is resolved and hopefully that threat to the residents, to the community is removed, the housing authority can get another family in there who's going to abide by the terms of the lease and contribute positively, to the community. So that's really the goal here. It's not to evict people, but it's to be able to evict the people who are negatively affecting life for the other residents, which the Housing Authority understands, I understand, is a vast majority of the residents are abiding by their lease, extremely good members of the community. It's just the rare cases where the Housing Authority wants to be able to have a little bit more teeth and be able to be a little bit more aggressive in this area, which I know is one of Commissioner Russo's favorite topics. So I don't know if you want to go through specific aspects of it, or if anybody has any comment.
No.
You know, in the late 80s and early 90s, we had the crack epidemic. So very strict rules and laws were very appropriate.
Correct.
New York had a murder rate 10 times what it is now. So I think that's why it was so stiff back then. And it can be eased up and more thoughtful now.
And that totally understood, Commissioner Lewitt. That my comments, and I apologize if they came off that way, were not to judge why it was done almost 20 years ago versus why the climate is where it is now. It's definitely changing factors and changing views on rehabilitation and things like that. And frankly, whether or not the previous policies worked. A lot of them did, some of them didn't. So it's not a commentary on that, it's just, I guess, trying to change with the times. And in here, I apologize, Madam Chair, in here is some guidance for the Housing Authority in addition to things and factors that have to be considered. There's some guidance in here about if the offense is a weapons offense. In general, this is what a resident can expect in terms of the Housing Authority action. Or if you have a marijuana use versus cocaine distribution, things like that. There are different levels, and I think this policy does a much better job of setting expectations both for the Housing Authority and for residents of, okay, if you engage in this activity, this is what you can expect. So even that, I think, has the potential, I mean, it's not going to cut down on everything, but it has the potential to make it clear, okay, these are the types of things we're talking about, and these are the potential consequences of your actions. And one thing, and I know this comes up frequently, so I'll be brief, even though the state of New Jersey has decriminalized marijuana, marijuana is still I forget what it is, schedule, whatever it is under the federal government. It is still prohibited in federally subsidized housing. It is not permitted on Housing Authority property, whether that's the sale, possession, use of marijuana. So under this policy, there will be consequences if the Housing Authority can document and can prove in front of a judge the sale, possession, or use of marijuana. So obviously, in where we are now, this is not where we were 20 years ago. The use of a small quantity of marijuana is not considered as serious as it was 20 years ago.
You shouldn't go to jail for 15 years.
Exactly. So in here and in the guidance for the Housing Authority, the potential consequences and the potential result is not as serious for something like that as it is for a much more serious offense. So I think it just makes things a lot clearer and sets good expectations for everybody involved. Yes, Madam Chair.
I just want to say two things. One thing is I'm very proud of this draft that we came up with, because I know that Commissioner Russo, Ms. Sykes, we all worked very hard on our committee last year to get this done along with Frank and the director. I'm very proud of it. I'm glad that one of the things that we did consider for those who unfortunately were addicted, that our goal is not to just kick you out, is that if you need rehab, we will help you, or at least try our best to get you rehabilitation and take all those actions before anything, before you are actually evicted. And I think that's where we may differ from some other places that may not take that into into consideration. So that's one of the things that I'm very proud of to be able to put into this draft. Because unfortunately, living here, we see a lot of addiction, and sometimes you see people that one day are fine, and months from now you see them and they're a totally different person. Everybody goes through things, so I'm glad that we were able to all get together and implement that into this policy. But also stating on what you said, Matt, when you state that it's decriminalized on federal property, it is. The issue we're having is it's hard for officers. The truth is the officers don't want to arrest you for marijuana on housing authority property. Now, as a commissioner who lives down here, one of the biggest complaints I get is they're sitting in the hallways, they're smoking weed. They're in front of Harrison Garden in the courtyard, they're smoking weed. My son is coming in and out of the building, they're smoking weed. So that's fine that the officers can't criminalize it, right? Because of everything that's going on, and I understand that. But then I think it becomes our issue, the housing authority. We have cameras. Get those residents. I get it. People don't want to talk. Listen, I will sit in that office and I will say who it is, because someone has to take action. If we're making these rules and nobody's willing to say who the resident is, these rules mean nothing to anyone. It's a waste of your time, my time, and everybody else's time. And I don't know how anybody else feels here, but as a resident, I do feel this. I think that, yes, we cannot make the officers do any more than they're doing, I want to say, because they're also kind of on their own restraints through the state actions. But then we need to take action, and then we have to start holding these individuals who are selling marijuana, who are smoking marijuana, who are doing all of this on our property. Then we have to start holding them accountable.
Yes.
And if I may, Madam Chair, you raised a few very good issues, and we talked about this a lot in the committee meetings that resulted in the development of this plan, that yes, we have to rely on the Hoboken Police Department. They've been great partners, but it's not their responsibility to enforce our lease. So it's going to take a lot of heavy lifting from the Housing Authority in terms of being able to document these cases. It's not enough to say, oh, so-and-so was smoking marijuana on Tuesday at 9:15. Well, if we don't have camera footage, if we don't have somebody from the Housing Authority who can say, oh, well, I saw it, an employee, things like that, it's not going to do much. And then the third aspect of it is we need other residents to be as much involved in this as the Housing Authority is. We need other residents to be able to say, this is what happened, put it in writing, or be willing to testify, whatever it is, that I saw him smoking at this time, he's out there every weeknight, whatever it is. And I understand, and the Housing Authority understands, that that's going to take a level of trust. And this policy is hopefully a big step in that direction to show that the Housing Authority is serious, that the board is serious, that the staff is serious. And hopefully that will help foster a partnership between the residents, between the Housing Authority, to try and clean things up for the vast majority of the residents who do everything they're supposed to. And then another thing, and it's a minor point, it might sound silly, but you hit on a good point, Madam Chair, with the idea of rehabilitation and these other things that are outlined in here. That's why this is not called a one strike and you're out policy, which is what a one strike policy really was. The idea was any criminal offense having to do with violence, drugs, weapons, you're out. No questions asked. If the Housing Authority can prove that it happened, that's it. And it didn't matter if it was marijuana use or selling crack. The idea here is that it's a criminal activity policy to consider the facts of what happened and try and use common sense, yes, but also some compassion in how things are handled, to try and improve everything for everybody involved, not just kick out anybody who we don't like what they did.
Absolutely. I think Barbara and Matt have spoken so well on this, I don't know what else to say. I do have a comment or two. Did you have something?
No, great.
In speaking with residents across, since this has been passed, there was just a couple areas that we highlighted in meetings, which is the idea that we can't evict on the basis of suspicion or rumor, which is almost what Matt just touched on. We need evidence. We need something we can take to court. And folks are often coming in, we talked about this at a number of resident meetings, that it just isn't enough to say, I think I saw George up here, or somebody up here. We need some facts to go by. And at the same time, another conversation point was this idea of what a grievance can be or how the housing authority can be checked. And part of that process is that hearing process. Now, we do have hearings in my office on a regular basis. There is a way to grieve it. If you're given that notice to quit or that notice to cease, you can come and we will have an informal hearing. On a major issue such as drug use or weapons use, the law in New Jersey is that we do not have to have a hearing. We can go directly to court, but my practice, and I'll say this clearly, my practice is to usually have a hearing. I welcome folks into my office to sit down and tell me, this is what happened. This is exactly what happened. And that's, I think, Barbara, where we can often intercede with somebody that may have been on the right track, but something happened, but now they come in with their pastor and some folks, and we can talk about it and make some accommodation possibly. And we have done that on a number of times. And this, I think, explains it very clearly on that, and that's one of the reasons I welcome this policy, because it makes that policy that we've often been doing a reality, written in policy. And those are the two things I think at resident meetings that we talk about the most.
And if I may just hit on the idea of grievances, Director. This is specifically with respect to public housing. So technically right now this does not apply to Fox Hill. Fox Hill Gardens, there is no right to a formal grievance hearing. However, there is a right to an informal hearing with a certain process prior to any complaint, eviction action being filed in court. So when I speak about this, this applies to just public housing. In the state of New Jersey, as the director mentioned, HUD has determined that the state of New Jersey's court process has all of the elements of due process that are required. So in criminal activity cases, there is no automatic right to a grievance hearing. There's actually no right to any hearing. But as the director alluded to, I think it's good policy, and I think the director thinks it's good policy, that residents are offered the opportunity for an informal hearing, an opportunity to come in and explain their side of the story. And maybe there's something that the Housing Authority just doesn't know. So it would be to consider that idea of, oh, well, yes, I did beat him up, but I was defending my friend who was threatened because of X, Y, or Z. Or, I was in a pretty bad place, but I have since entered a rehab program. This is where I'm going, this is my status, and I'm committed to making things like that. So the informal process would enable the Housing Authority to better understand that before we get to the point of court. Now, occasionally that will maybe lead to the Housing Authority willing to consider alternate sanctions. And the Housing Authority won't have to spend the money, frankly, on me to go to trial, things like that. It'll save the resident some aggravation of worrying for, right now it's taking so long, up to a year, am I going to lose my housing? When maybe that's not the case as a result of the informal hearing. So the informal hearing is a great thing. The Housing Authority, the residents are always entitled to some level of due process. Just because there is not a grievance hearing doesn't mean they don't have a right to a trial, a right to present their case at trial. So essentially the Housing Authority is not giving anything away in terms of the current criminal activity policy to now. It's not reducing any of the tenants' rights. I think it's frankly strengthening it because it is a lot clearer on the steps the Housing Authority needs to take before they can pursue this action. The current policy is fairly open-ended on, you can file a complaint there's not a lot that has to be considered. Well, here it lays out exactly what has to be considered, so it, I think, is fairer to residents in that sense. So just hearing, oh, well, there's no right to a grievance hearing, may worry residents, but that's the case now. That's not a change.
I have a fast question. What, may I?
Yes, absolutely.
When we switch over to red, do we, we'll have to update this policy?
So it is, yes, is the short answer. The longer answer is that this policy will technically become, by reference, part of the admissions and continued occupancy policy, which will cease to exist once everything is converted to red. Everything would be governed not by the public housing ACOP, admissions and continued occupancy policy, but by the Section 8 admin plan. So yes, the residents would still have rights, it would still be laid out clearly, and there have been some discussions about what, if anything, should be incorporated into the admin plan with respect to criminal activity, because you did update the ACOP last summer and adopt a new one. However, the admin plan is at a draft stage. So the idea is that sometime in the mid-range future, the Housing Authority would be considering an entirely new admin plan, which would consider some, if probably not all, but some aspects and maybe some differences of this criminal activity policy. But the short answer is yes, this would go away, but the idea is that something very similar that fit within the four corners of the Section 8 program, the voucher program, would be in place as well.
Are the voucher program rules kind of the same, or how does that work?
So like the money part is pretty much the same, so 30% of your income is still what governs it. There is no such thing as flat rent, so 30% is what you're going to pay, so that's a big difference. So someone right now, once they hit, let's say they start making $1 million, they would pay flat rent. In Section 8, they would pay 30% of that $1 million.
But on the criminal side.
On the criminal side, on the rules.
Pretty much all the things that are a criminal thing are state rules, so it's not going to change that much. This criminal policy pretty much will be able to be absorbed into the admin plan.
Right, there are very slight differences in terms of the HUD regulations between the two, but they are mostly minor. So it may change some of the wording of this policy,
But essentially,
with respect to the admin plan, but the guts of it, the heart of it, are the same.
Okay, good. And in the end on these, they're only as good as what you can get through a judge.
sure.
So that's where we work toward on these, is speaking to that judge. So there's got to be consistency between them. Okay.
Director, now, once these are passed, you guys stated that this is going to be brought to us on our next meeting, correct?
Yes.
Now, how soon do these new plans get passed through to the residents? Because putting them on the website, I get it. We're in a new era, everybody has a computer, but we're always gonna get those people that say, I don't know how to use a computer, I don't have it. And how are we going to make sure that all our current residents now have the updated policy and have signed for it? Somehow, like, we need a receipt to say, no, you did receive it after August 11, 2022. How are we gonna do that?
If I may, I know the question was directed to you, but if I may, Madam Chair, when this was sent out as a draft in March, so even before it was introduced by the board for comment, it also came with a draft memo that will go out to all the residents at the time. And it highlights essentially why this is being changed. And I'm speaking right now specifically about the criminal activity policy, not necessarily changes to the ACOP, although I would think widespread distribution would be similar in terms of what I'm about to explain. So this memo would go out saying this is essentially why it's being changed, some highlights on the major changes, and also fairly extensive detail on marijuana, reminding residents that just because everybody has this idea that marijuana is legal now, it is not legal. It's essentially that the state of New Jersey has decided not to enforce the law on it, and that it's still not permitted on housing authority property. So that memo would go out to every resident. We've talked about how exactly The plan itself would be distributed. Obviously, in that memo, it would make at the very least, it would make reference to the policy being available on the website, paper copies, things like that. I don't know if the intention is to distribute it at that time to every resident, but as you alluded to, this has not no teeth, but it doesn't work very well if we don't make sure the residents are aware of everything that's in here. So one thing we've talked about is strengthening our efforts to make sure it's included in recertification packages, that it's signed for on an annual basis, that residents say, I have this, and if they read it, essentially it's up to them. But you gave this to me, and I understand that I have to abide by it. That will obviously strengthen any case the Housing Authority brings to court, but it will also make sure the Housing Authority knows that, okay, every resident was given this. We're not sliding it under doors and things like that and hoping people see it. The idea is to make sure that this is signed for on an annual basis.
My only concern is what happens to the people that have already recertified prior to August. That means that they wouldn't get it till the following year. Something happens in between.
And we've had some discussions. We've had some discussions about how that might be handled. Obviously, recertification is done on an annual basis, and this is going to be effective as of a certain date. So we've had some discussions about that, about how we handle people who have recently recertified.
So I think we're going to.
So there's a plan in place, in other words?
Yeah, our discussion is that we need a mass distribution, because you do have those folks that haven't recertified yet. Once the initial mass distribution happens, then it becomes part of the recertification cycle after that.
Right, and it may be that this is distributed with that memo, and frankly, it may be that it's slid under doors the first time. But the idea is that within a year, everybody will have been there in person, sat down with their manager, received a copy of it, and signed for it.
Because we don't think it's practical to have every single resident come in and re-sign just for these two things. We'll do a mass distribution website, memo, copies available at your manager's office, at central office, and then it will be part of the recertification process. That was our idea.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, just in general, following through it that way is fine, right? Right now, they haven't signed off on it, right? So if half of our residents are recertifying from now until then, great, they'll sign off, and then the other half haven't. No big deal at this point. By next year, this time, all residents should have signed off on it, so.
In the meantime, we'll be pushing it out. And if you come up with some other ideas, we'll be glad to do it. But we'll have copies at all the manager's office, at our central office. I should just remind everyone, once we pass it in August, it's still got the HUD thing, so I would think it'll be September.
More September-ish.
Yeah.
And I apologize, I don't have the exact number, but under the regulations, HUD has a certain number of days to provide comment, and if they don't, it's deemed accepted.
45.
I want to say it's 45, actually. I don't know if that's a total guess, but I want to say it's 45, that if we send it to HUD, and within those 45 days, if they don't respond to us, it's deemed accepted, and we are free to move forward and implement it.
Awesome.
So that would be around the 1st of October.
So if we bring private developers into developing a lot of the property, and they have their own rules, how will that work out?
We will have a say in those.
Right, obviously, that's a much more longer term. That will be, we will have an admin plan in place at that point, whether it's the current version or hopefully an updated version that will have some form of language with respect to criminal activity, but also as part of the RAD program or whatever HUD program, for HUD to sign off on it, the Housing Authority has to have a significant say in what an individual lease says. Now, if there's a different lease for Fox Hill Gardens as opposed to a different location, whatever, yes, there might be slight differences there between the leases, but the Housing Authority still has significant input, significant approval on whatever is implemented. Yes.
Any questions?
Yes, I'm just gonna feedback what Barbara was saying, like with the certification, when we had it on when we do our certification, we sign off It has a list of all of that, the criminal thing, if you do this, such and such, you do. But when we sign off, it goes back to them, we don't have a copy. So like when you, now all these papers that you got is a lot. So now my access citizen getting a copy of it, no, we just sign it and it goes back to them. Before I was taking it, and they said, you're missing something. I said, I thought that was my copy. So we need to read it more thoroughly so we can understand. And then with the speaking, with the Spanish people, they need to have it in English and Spanish, because a lot of them in this building speaks Spanish or read Spanish, so they don't understand the English part. And if you have like somebody in the office that just speaks English, you need somebody to translate and for them to understand.
Yes.
But if they have it in the Spanish and the English, it would make a difference.
Absolutely.
And then they will have a copy, then they will understand. Now the part with the marijuana, like I said, the cops can't touch it because it's legal. But my problem is with that, you got so many young ones out there smoking. It's too many of them. You walk by, there's a section there, there's a section there, there's a section there. And I'm like, well, what the devil is going on? They all smoking. It's like a lit up place over there by 4 projects and outside the gate.
And they actually antagonize the officers, to be honest. They'll talk
Yes,
to
and
them.
they do it intentionally.
Literally.
Because they know they can't be touched. But in the meantime, I thought you're supposed to have a prescription card.
No, not
No
anymore.
more.
Not no more, right?
No more.
So you could just freely smoke the thing, walk
Yes.
down the street and smoke.
This
Yeah.
is not a housing authority problem anymore.
No.
This is a problem
City.
all over the city, all over the state.
So what
I
about
mean,
in the
literally.
building? The building is a non-smoking area,
The-
right?
the-
This is federal property.
Yeah.
This is where,
So with
I'm gonna
respect
tell you,
to...
I'm sorry.
No, you go first.
The funniest part is that the housing authority probably has more teeth, so to speak, in enforcing the policy than anywhere else in the city of Hoboken.
Oh, okay,
So because this is a federally funded program
yes.
and property, we have the ability to really enforce that law because it's a federal law.
Well,
Anywhere else in the city of Hoboken, the state law is, I don't want to say it prevails because that's not necessarily true, but the reality is no one is going to enforce any federal law against someone smoking in city limits, except for probably the housing authority. So it's probably one of the better places in terms of trying to stop people from smoking marijuana. But this is the new world we live in, and the changes are coming, because the reality is, I think, on a federal level, it will change soon. So, and then the whole world changes again.
Right, and if it changes on a federal level, under our policy, essentially will immediately change because the policy does not speak directly to marijuana in the event that marijuana is
Correct.
ever legalized on a federal level. So no changes would be needed, but marijuana would be theoretically completely legal. Although, we've talked in the past, the smoke-free policy for the Housing Authority
Correct.
only applies to lit tobacco products currently, because that's all that HUD required. And at the time, it wasn't legal in the state of New Jersey. So the decision was made a few years ago not to incorporate it, and if we need to revisit it, the Housing Authority will revisit it. So currently, that policy doesn't even apply to marijuana. It's just that marijuana is totally prohibited in federally funded housing.
Right.
So it is banned for that reason, not because it's smoke-free. Now, there have been discussions about the potential for revisiting the smoke-free policy to include other things than lit tobacco products, to include marijuana or whatever. So that is another possibility, and I think there's some support for that, but that's not part of what's potentially before the board in 10 days.
We just, in the city of Hoboken, we just made a change to our park, the smoke-free policy in reference to parks. So we don't allow any smoking of any materials, right? It could be tobacco, it could be hookah, it could be marijuana, it could be anything. And we also included vape in that, so that was part of it, so.
Right, that's another thing that's not
Yeah.
included in the smoke-free policy. E-cigs
So
are
that's
not
good.
considered lit tobacco products.
So that's something we should probably do.
Think about it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And again, as long as we're talking about criminal policies, I just want to make that point again, that our issue is enforcing.
Correct.
Our issue is when somebody smells that pot in the hallway, yes, we could go after that, but we need a couple of residents to be able to say, we know that unit 2B, it's coming out of there, we smell it all the time, so we can then start the process of going after that person. If we don't have somebody that is willing to testify and say it's coming from that apartment, we've got no teeth. It's a rumor, essentially.
But it's not a rumor when it's happening in our homes. That's not.
But it's essentially what I can
But who
prove
is
to a
it?
judge.
Yeah,
What can
what
I
can you
prove to a
prove to
judge
a
that
judge?
this happened?
Right.
And the sad part is the cameras don't have a nose, right?
No.
Like,
Yeah. And it's the same
We
procedure.
just got something in the mail this week.
Now, we've gotten some success in a couple of instances where people have complained about cigarettes, and we've zoned in on that unit, and we've managed to get a reduction from that unit by notices to cease and saying, we're coming after you, smoke the cigarettes. And it works, it doesn't work, but we've managed to get a reduction on a couple of those. So we need the same thing on marijuana. So it's hard.
Just can't censor.
And then we need to, I can't help it, then we need to advertise gummy bears.
Yes.
Well, and as Ms. Smith alluded to, we're never going to stop all of the use of marijuana, but the idea here is that if residents buy in and are trusting the housing authority, and the housing authority is pursuing these things to, whether it's eviction or cessation of whatever the action is, then more residents will buy in, will be willing to put it in writing, will be willing to testify, and it'll be
You're absolutely.
a cycle that will produce good results. And word will get around that the housing authority is taking action with respect to this. Is that going to stop everybody? Absolutely not. But it might stop a few people, and that might spread to a handful of people and half the people, whatever. But we got to start somewhere.
But the reality is, I'm not so concerned about the one-offs. I'm
Right.
more concerned about the dealing, the large amounts. Those are the things that I'm worried about, right? It's not so much, the one person walking on housing authority property smoking a joint. That to me is not
It's
my
the
big
people
concern.
bringing trouble to their neighbors.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Right.
Is
Great.
that it?
I think that's it.
Anybody
Motions?
anybody on
any
Zoom have any
questions?
comments? Commissioner Impastato, Commissioner Sanford?
I don't have any comments, no. I'm enjoying this conversation, though, and I appreciate everyone's hard work in the subcommittee for sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
No questions.
Awesome.
Motion to close?
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you all.
There you go.
Thank you. And thank you both.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies.
Oh, yes, I got the.
So Ms. Smith, those are actually great suggestions.
Yes.
Appreciate that. And it's good to know, I mean, that's news to me that not every resident was living there with a copy of it, whether it was because they didn't understand or whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is, gotta make sure we get copies out there, make sure everybody has it, so I appreciate
As
that.
a tenant president in this building, like someone come to me and they ask
Recording
me
stopped.
why you don't have it in Spanish.
Yep.
So I said, well, I will bring it up again when we have our meetings. And that's why I always tell Daniel when we have things, put it in English and in Spanish. Because a lot of them do read Spanish, it's more
yes.
better for them than